Thank you all very much for coming. A few issues have drawn more attention and spawned more controversy during the early months of the 2011 session of the General Assembly than the debate over charter schools. And at this point, lawmakers seem poised to dramatically expand the state's experiment with charters. Now, actually, our second speaker today, Representative Rick Glazier, who I'll give you his bio here in a little bit, is actually in the middle of negotiations, I believe, as we speak on this matter. So, and this and perhaps another controversial matter of the General Assembly, so he may be delayed slightly, but he will be joining us around 12:30. So the question with charters, of course, is this a good idea? What is the track record of charter schools here and elsewhere? Are they really the solution to what ails our public schools? Should they serve as a discrete set of laboratories that support the traditional schools, or as, in effect, an alternative public education system? Today we're going to hear from Dr. Helen Ladd and Representative Glazier. We're also here briefly from my colleague Christopher Hill, who's the director of the Education and Law Project at the North Carolina Justice Center. We'll also hear from my other colleague, Sarah Ovaska, our investigative reporter at NC Policy Watch. But we thought we'd briefly begin with our latest Carolina Issues poll that we did last week. This is something we've done periodically through the years at Policy Watch. We have an arrangement with the very widely acclaimed Public Policy Polling, which is a national polling firm based here in Raleigh that's widely recognized by folks on all sides of the political spectrum as an honest broker and a really high quality polling firm. So last week they did some questions for us on charter schools and on education in general, and so we thought we'd briefly share those results with you right now. All right. On charters generally, this is something I think probably doesn't come as much of a surprise to anybody. We asked the question, do you have a generally favorable or unfavorable impression of charter schools? And you can see that there were a lot of people who weren't sure, but in general, of those people who did have an impression, the impression was favorable. Also, on the question of racial segregation, which is a concern that's been raised by some critics of charter schools, should this be a concern? And actually, as you can see, a slight majority said it shouldn't be a particular concern. So that's probably jives with what we've been generally perceiving. On some other issues, though, these are some of the debates that have been going on at the General Assembly. Should charters provide school lunches? As we know, many charters do not provide free and reduced price lunches, as do the traditional public schools. And we can see here that a significant majority does think that, in fact, charters should be required to provide free and reduced price lunches. On the question of transportation, slightly smaller majority, but still a significant proportion of registered voters in North Carolina also agreed that charters should be required to provide transportation like traditional public schools. On the question of only using certified teachers, this has also been a debate at the General Assembly. Again, a very significant majority thinks that they should only be required to hire certified teachers, principals, and administrators, 64 to 28. On the question of governance, charters should be governed by the State Board of Education rather than their own separate board. A 55 to 40 majority agrees with that. On the question of a related topic that's at the General Assembly, not specific to charters necessarily, but more on the question of whether homeschool kids and private school and religious school kids should be able to participate in interscholastic sports teams. That's a bill that's at the General Assembly. In general, a majority of people say that's not a good idea. They should not, that public schools should not be required to allow students at home schools and private schools to participate in traditional public school sports teams. On the questions of vouchers and tax credits, once again, this is a similar number to one we've seen many times in the past. By and large, a significant majority of North Carolinians, registered voters, and this is true mostly throughout the country, oppose the idea of vouchers and tax credits to parents who should send their kids to private or religious schools. Now, this is an interesting one. We also thought we'd check out and see what people were thinking about the debate with cuts to public education that are being threatened. And so, right now, as you know, the debate in the General Assembly is, although it's about the expiration of so-called temporary taxes, the debate is really, are we going to keep taxes where they are, or are we going to effectively cut taxes and thereby, of course, cut a lot of services? When we polled North Carolinian registered voters, would they support leaving our state tax levels at the current rate in order to avoid cuts in public education? It's 3 to 1, thinking that that's a good idea. This is the exact question that was asked. Teacher layoffs to balance the budget. This confirms, which I think is something that most of us suspected, which is that very few people in the state actually support the idea of laying off teachers and teachers' assistants in order to close the state budget shortfall. And then on the question of early childhood cuts also, similar numbers, 55 to 33, 3 to whatever that works out to be, 5 to 3% that people do not want to cut Smart Start, do not want to cut more for in order to balance the budget. So we thought these were interesting. These will be available on our website. They were released officially today. You can go to ncpolicywatch.com and read them. You can look at all the crosstabs that see the percentage of people of various demographic groups and political persuasions who were actually polled in the poll that took place last week. There were just short of 700 North Carolinians polled. So we thought you might find that interesting. And before we get to Dr. Ladd, we also have one other brief presentation. I'd like to invite my colleague Sarah Ovaska to come up. Sarah, many of you may know her byline for many years as a reporter with the News and Observer here in Raleigh. She joined the Policy Watch staff late last summer, right? Yeah. And has been doing a lot of incredible, excellent investigative reporting on a wide array of topics. And charter schools is a topic she's been looking into lately, and she wanted to share some of her preliminary findings and forecasts for future stories to come. Thanks.
Great, and thanks everyone for coming. I just wanted to take a quick moment just to talk about some of the work I've been doing at Policy Watch and taking a look at charters. I think that for the general public, there's a lot of confusion about what charters are and what they're doing and what the debate is. And obviously we're finding it's now a very heated debate, but there's still a lot of questions out there in the larger public about what they are and what they're doing. And as part of that, I'm taking a closer look at some of the charters we already have in the state. And specifically, I've spent some time out in Rutherford County, which is out in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and talking with folks there and in the community out there. There's been a real split in the community over those that are supportive of expanding charters and those who would like to see it not be expanded as rapidly. And a lot of that is stemmed from a lawsuit that was filed against the local school district. And so I've had some of my findings. I had a story up last week, and I'd encourage anybody to go and check that out at ncpolicywatch.com. And I'm planning on having more in the coming weeks and looking at what's happening in that community, and also a little bit more about the charter school there and kind of how this may or may not how charters are expanded, how that may take place in the rest of the state. So thanks very much.
Okay, well, we're going to begin our main program now. As I say, Representative Glazier will probably arrive with his tie askew and his hair wet here in a few minutes, but we're delighted to have him when he gets here. But we're going to begin with Dr. Helen Lab. Dr. Ladd is the Edgar Thompson Professor of Public Policy Studies and a Professor of Economics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. Most of her current research focuses on education policy. She is particularly interested in various aspects of school accountability, education finance, teacher labor markets, and school choice. She's written numerous articles and books on charter schools and other forms of choice in North Carolina, self-governing schools and parental choice in both New Zealand and the Netherlands, market-based reforms in urban school districts, voucher programs, and school reform in post-apartheid South Africa. In addition, with colleagues at Duke University, she has written extensively about school segregation, teacher labor markets, and teacher quality. We're honored to have her with us today. I asked her to come forward. She's got a PowerPoint that will go with her presentation. We'll try to cue that up. Thanks for coming, Dr. It's taking a second.
Okay. So thanks. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about charter schools. I am a researcher at heart, so I'm going to start off by talking about some of my research on charter schools in North Carolina, and you should be aware as I talk about that research is based on data from about 1996 to 2002. So it's not right up to date, but then I will talk more about the current situation, then I'm going to step back and give you my general thoughts about charters and where we go from here. As you'll see from my research, the results are pretty negative, but that doesn't mean I'm negative on charters across the board. I would like to just mention my husband, who's over here, Ted Fisk. He is on the board of a charter school in Durham, the Central Park School. I think We have the principal of that school, where he is here as well. Thanks, there you are. And together, Ted and I have looked at choice in a number of other countries. So a country that I'll refer to at one point is New Zealand, which introduced full parental choice of schools and competitions back in the early 1990s, and we went to New Zealand in 1998. One way to interpret the New Zealand situation is it's like having a whole country of charter schools. Now, there were schools that were converted from traditional public schools, but that allowed us to think about what happens when you have lots and lots of charter schools. So I'll come back to that issue. So let me talk about my early research. This research was with a fellow named Bob Bifulco, who was at Duke at the time, but now is at Syracuse University, and it is based on data through 2002. So we came to three main conclusions. So I'm just going to work through these conclusions. First one, and this is all just data on North Carolina. It's important when doing studies of charter schools to be state-specific, because the charter school laws, as you know, differ one state from another. So we were looking at North Carolina, and we had lots of good data. We had data on individual students, and we could see them moving from traditional public schools into a charter school. We could follow them over time. We had test score data and all sorts of things. First conclusion is charter schools increase racial segregation. And in the period we were looking at, that was very clear. And one of the ways, I mean, we could document what was happening because we could see kids moving from traditional public schools. So we'd see them in traditional public schools in 3rd or 4th grade and see them move into charter schools. We were not able to look at kids entering charter schools at kindergarten because we just can't follow those in our data. So we were looking at grades 4 through 8 for this study. But what we found was that as black families put their children into charter schools, they were choosing charter schools that were blacker than the traditional public schools that their children had been in. And then for whites, it went in the same direction for whites. Whites were choosing charter schools that were whiter than the schools that they had been in. So I've given you, I call them black switchers. These are families that are switching their child from a traditional public school to a charter school. So they were switching from 53% black to charter schools that on average were 70% black, and the white switchers were in schools that were 70% white, and they moved to even whiter charter schools. So there was no doubt in our mind that certainly during that period that charter schools were increasing racial segregation. The second point is that charter schools, during the period we were looking at, in the grades we were looking at, reduced student achievement on average. Now that isn't to say that there weren't some charter schools that were raising student achievement. Now what do I mean by raising or lowering student achievement? Because we had such rich data on all individual students and we could look at them over time, we could look at the gains that students made while they were in charter schools compared to the gains those students made while they were in traditional public schools, either earlier, before they were in the charter school, or afterwards, after they left the charter school and went back into 7th grade or 8th grade into the traditional public schools. And we found that average achievement went down, and it went down for all groups. It went down on average for whites and for blacks, and even more for blacks than for whites. I've put up some figures here that refer to effects on math test scores. We've normalized everything, so everything's in standard deviation units rather than scale scores. But the only reason for me to put the numbers here is to show you that there are declines for white students on average in the charter schools during the period we were looking at, and then greater declines for blacks, and especially for blacks who made racially segregating moves. So by racially segregating moves here, we're talking about black students who moved from a traditional public school to a charter school that was more than 60% black and more than 10 percentage points higher black percentage than the school from which they came. So I just highlighted at the bottom that this is based on careful modeling. We published all of this. It met all the peer-reviewed standards. There's a national study that looks at achievement of students in charter schools. This is the CREDO study that came out of Stanford that a number of you are probably familiar with, that looks at a number of different states, and they basically confirm our results for North Carolina. So in some other states, sometimes the results are a bit more positive, but overall, nationally, that Stanford study suggests that only 17% of the charter schools outperform the traditional public schools that the children otherwise would have gone to, and that North Carolina was one of the states that was clearly having not very positive, in other words, negative effects. So the third conclusion that follows from these first two and from additional analysis is that charter schools in this state were increasing the black-white test score gap. Now, part of that comes just from the fact that during the period we were looking at, blacks were overrepresented in charter schools. So I think I have the numbers here. In 2002, blacks accounted for 40% of the charter school population, but only 31% of the traditional public school population. So if blacks students are the ones who are disproportionately moving to the charter school sector, and the charter school sector on average is lowering achievement, that means you're going to increase the black-white test score gap. And then you add to that the fact, our finding that black students were doing even less well in charter schools relative to how they would have done in the traditional public school. That effect gets exacerbated. So those were our three main conclusions. And let me now try to update us a little bit. I haven't done a new study, and I can't do a new careful achievement study now because of the study design we used. It only worked when we had a lot of people switching in grades 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 into the charter schools, and now we've got more of them. I can't go back and do that. But what I did go back is just to try to give an overall picture. So what we've got here is the racial breakdown of charter schools, and I separated K through 8 and then all charter schools. So if you look at those top numbers, so for elementary and middle schools, we've got 52% of the students in the charter schools are white, 36% are black, 7% Hispanic, and slightly different figures when you include in the high schools. So if you just looked at those numbers, you'd say, oh, good, this whole sector, this charter school sector is a diverse sector, and so we don't need to worry about racial segregation. But that's not the right way to look at it, because that's the sector as a whole. The key point here is individual schools, individual charter schools are very segregated. So I looked up the most recent data, and we've got, I don't know whether this is based on 99 schools or 100, but in any case, we've got 37 schools, charter schools, now that have more than 80% white students. And 10 of those 37 actually have more than 90%, and some of them 99%. So we've got a number of schools, more than a third of the schools that are very white now. And then 26 schools now have less than 20% white students, and so the non-white students include black students or Hispanic students and Indian students. The key point there is we've got different types of schools, some serving white families, some serving black families. I looked up to see how many charter schools had some mix of students. So this is between 40 and 60% white. You could state it the other way around too, between 40 and 60% non-white. The reason, and there are very few schools, there are a few in that category. But the reason I put that up there is in our earlier research, when we found that a lot of black families were moving their children into charter schools that ended up being 90 to 100% black, a number of people turned to us and say, well, that's what families want. And we tried to analyze that earlier in our research to try to figure out if that is what black families want. And we estimated some models called low-chip models that look at probabilities of different things happening. And based on that modeling, we concluded that black families choosing charter schools preferred schools that were 40 to 60% black-white. But the white families, as they made their charter school decisions, preferred schools that were less than 20% black. So what that means when you put those asymmetric preferences together is you're not going to end up with many schools that have 40 to 60% or a balance of black and white, because the minute schools get to be 30%, 40%, 50% black, they tip. And that's the term that a lot of economists use as they talk about residential segregation. But that works for schools as well. So white families then take their kids out of those schools that are increasingly black, and then you end up with very black schools. One other point from our earlier research, we do find a lot of movement of kids into charter schools and then out of schools. And that's important for the policy debate. So one of the explanations we came up with for the low performance in some charter schools was just you've got a lot of movement of students. African Americans in particular might have been looking for a better school for their kids. The traditional public schools weren't working for them. They put their kids in charter schools. That wasn't working. They moved them out. And that means, at least in the period we were looking at earlier, the pre-2002 period, you had a lot of turnover in these schools. We all know, or all the educators in the room know, that having a lot of turnover in schools is not conducive to providing good, coherent education. So I had the data on race. I don't have as much on the income levels of students, but based on 2008-2009 data that was provided by the Durham Public School District at a recent breakfast that I went to, they provided data on the percent of students statewide who are on free and reduced price lunch. That's what the FRPL is. So in the traditional public schools, about 43% of children are on free and reduced price lunch, and that's a lot lower in the charter schools. And there's other data we could look at as well. For example, the percentage of the students who are special needs students. The charter schools underserve the students who are special needs students relative to the traditional public schools. I've provided some data for Durham, which does come from the Durham School District based on 2007-08 data. So there, for the Durham public schools, the traditional public schools, 54% of the students are on free and reduced price lunch, and the 7 charter schools on average in the city have only 32%. There's a star there, and they're pointing that the percent of students in the traditional public schools is rising. So what we've got in a city like Durham, which has a lot of charter schools, is the charter schools serving blacks, and there is a slight, there are disproportionately more blacks in the Durham public schools, in the Durham charter schools than in the traditional public schools, but the charter schools are serving a less needy group of students on average. So what else is going on? In preparation for this talk, I followed up on an issue that has always been a major one for me, which is issues related to accountability. Education has a large public interest. There is a large public interest in education. I'll come back and say a little more about that. So I talked to people in DPI just to figure out what's going on. Things seem to have gotten better from the time I did the research in 2002. So DPI, the Office of Charter Schools, well, first there's the law that now requires a 1-year planning period before a new charter school is started. That makes a lot of sense. It's hard work to set up a new school, and there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So DPI provides assistance during that planning period, and then there's oversight from DPI during the first few years of operation. This makes a lot of sense to me and could improve the operation of charter schools. But I do note here that as of 2008, there were 8 employees in that BPI office doing some of this oversight and providing services, and there are only 3 now related to budget cuts. So if we think these sorts of services are important, which I do, we've got a problem here. So, so where do we go from here? Just one further statement. I told you I can't do any new work and haven't done any new work looking at the achievement effects of charter schools in the recent period. I do know a lot of supporters of charter schools point out that lots of charter schools are doing well, they're meeting performance standards, AYP. You have to be really careful as you look at all of that. If charter schools are serving a more advantaged student body, not all of them are, but if they are on average, you would expect them to do better on some of those measures. So we have to be very careful about drawing any conclusions about the effectiveness of charter schools relative to traditional public schools just by looking at the standard, easy to look at measures of performance on AYP. What you need to do is go back and look at individual students and try to figure out how they would have done otherwise. So where do we go from here in North Carolina? 2 main choices: expand charters cautiously. I guess there's another choice: don't expand them or get rid of them, but I just don't think that's on the policy agenda at all, so I didn't include that. And keep them on the fringe of the education system, or expand charters significantly and dramatically. So my strong preference is to expand cautiously and to keep them on the fringe of the system. And that reflects a couple of things. First and most important one for me is it reflects what I think the education system is all about. It generates public as well as private benefits. That's why we make education compulsory. That's why we're funding public education, because we think that education in this state increases the productivity and the economic health of this state and the political health of the state. And we also think education is important for the life chances of individuals, so there's an equity judgment. So those public benefits of interest are really central to all of the thinking that I do about education policy. But this preference for not expanding broadly also comes from my observations in New Zealand, which I mentioned a little while ago, has the equivalent of a whole country of charter schools, albeit charter schools that converted from traditional public schools. So this is my last slide. So I don't know how long I've been talking, and I'll talk through it. Just briefly.
You're good.
What?
You're good.
Yeah, I'm fine, but I need to know whether to go through this quickly or in 5 minutes or so. And then I hope we can open up for some discussion. So these are some of the reasons that I think it's really important to move very cautiously as we expand charter schools. So the first one is maintain the quality. Now, the quality has been low in many charter schools in the past, but I think we owe it to our kids to make sure that new schools that are opened are quality schools. I mean, there are reasons low-income African Americans are choosing some of these charter schools. They're looking for a quality school. The traditional public school may not be working for them for all sorts of reasons. But if we're going to give them additional options, we need to make sure those options have a strong possibility of being effective schools. So what do we need for that? Well, we need accountability, we need oversight, and we need support. I mentioned earlier, there's the sense that it's hard work to set up a new school, and there are lots of aspects of that. There's the developing the educational program, the instructional model, but there's also the business model and everything else that goes with that. So I'm all in favor of having employees at DPI there available to give that support. And so that's going to cost some money, and we shouldn't ignore that. There are some costs involved. This leadership, that second point there, turns out to be very important. Ted and I visited lots and lots of schools in New Zealand, and the first schools we visited were the ones that the policymakers who loved this new shift to choice, loved to show off to outsiders. Some of these schools just had dynamic leaders, charismatic leaders, and you'd go in and you'd say, boy, isn't this school great? 2 points about this. 2 years later, you'd go back and you'd see that that charismatic leader had burned out and was no longer there. He was just, or she was just exhausted. The other point about it is we cannot plan, or should not plan, to build an education system that requires leaders be charismatic and fantastic and abnormal. You just can't build a system there. You need to build a system that can operate with more normal people, like the rest of us. And so, because there's a shortage of that energy. It doesn't mean there aren't some terrific leaders and entrepreneurs out there and that we shouldn't take advantage of those, but you just can't build a whole system on that type of leader. And then I've just been reading a report that came out recently from the state of Washington, but it's about national charter schools, and they really emphasize the importance of having strong, well-trained governing boards. So each of these charter schools is run by a governing board, and as a state, if we were to go further with charter schools, we'd need to make sure that those governing boards get the sort of training that would be useful. So all of that costs resources and whatever. So my view is if we're going to do all of those well, we can't have this dramatic expansion of charter schools because there's no way we can do all of that with 50 new charter schools a year, much less 10 new a year, maybe 3 or 4 we could handle. Second point here is just relates to back to one of the initial purposes of charter schools. You know, one of the justifications for charter schools is to promote innovation. So the starting point is we have this big bureaucratic system running, the system's running lots of schools. We need to have some opportunities for people with good ideas to be able to pursue those ideas. And that makes some sense to me. There isn't a lot of evidence nationwide that some of the ideas in charter schools have been translated back into the traditional public school system. There's one reason for that. Some of the best charter schools nationwide, like the KIPP school, do things like have many more instructional hours at school on Saturdays and all sorts of things. So it's not that they're being particularly innovative in terms of programs. What they're doing is spending more and more time on instruction and being focused on test taking, but we can come back to that. But my view is charters have a role to play. I mean, I buy this argument that the system as a whole it's hard to move it, and you wouldn't want to take the whole system and make major changes before you knew whether some of those changes might work. So I like the idea of having this fringe that can try new things and explore new ways of educating children. Now, notice when you're innovating that there are risks involved. So some of these innovations may work and some won't. So if you've got charters just on the fringe of the system and the state decides to charter this particular charter school and then it doesn't quite work out, that's okay, because all of those kids, a relatively small number, can then go back into the traditional public school system. And because education is compulsory, you've got to make sure that they have good schools to go back to. And so that's one point. And then the second here comes directly from our New Zealand experience. New Zealand thought they were going to have all these innovative schools. Each one had its own charter and its own mission, and wasn't this going to be terrific? But the minute they had all of those schools, or within a couple of years, not within a minute, but within a couple of years, they realized that there really is a public interest here in education. And so they started saying, look, each of these charters, which initially were envisioned as school-specific charters, really have to pay attention to this public interest. So the state came in and started regulating them a lot more. And so then you lost some of the capacity to be innovative. So that's why I like keeping charters on the fringe of the system so that we can maintain this opportunity to use them for one of the initial purposes. I put to facilitate capital planning here. That was an issue that came up in New Zealand, and New Zealand actually did maintain ownership of all the school buildings, even though all the schools then were had been converted from public schools, traditional public schools, to charter. And this issue of capital planning came up over and over again. So whenever people said, well, maybe additional funding should be used so it's easier for other charter schools to be set up, there was a cost concern there. If you have space in these schools and not, why spend a lot of money on capital to build new schools? So some of it is just, you know, the building of new schools and the cost of that. Some of it is just planning. If you don't know how many students are going to be in the traditional public school next year or 5 years from now, how do you plan in a cost-effective way in terms of building your facility? And then I've got this next to last point, avoiding the emergence of charter school bureaucracies. And what's happening in many other states is there are these large charter management organizations, or if it's for-profit, it's education management organizations, and they're developing their own bureaucracies. I mean, they're running 20 schools, 50 schools, 99 schools. And so the question is, do we want to end up in a system where we've got a new set of bureaucracies, and it would be a set because in any state there might be several of these big organizations. So that's another reason for keeping the charters on the fringe of the system and to avoid that aspect. And then this last one is avoiding the resegregation of North Carolina schools. I was interested in the poll results that you just presented, that some people don't think that's very important. Some of us in this state and in Raleigh think this issue is extremely important, and I'm one of those people. So I don't want to set up a system that has some schools for blacks and some schools for whites, or some for high-income kids and some for low-income kids. And I worry if we open up the floods to charter schools, that's what we're going to end up with. And once you open that up, it's hard to pull it back. So I hope we can hold on to the good things we've got now and move cautiously to maintain some of the positive benefits of charter schools without allowing for some of the undesirable effects that pay insufficient attention to the public interest in education. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ladd. That was great. I really appreciate that. I'm going to get this off the screen and ask Representative Glazier to come forward. Representative Rick Glazier is one of the most knowledgeable state legislators on a wide array of issues. He's been a staunch defender of the public education system. He's been chair of the Education Committee. He is currently a sponsor of legislation on charter schools. I believe he's probably even been working on that legislation in recent days or hours, and perhaps he can come and share his insights with us on this matter and anything else he wants to talk about.
Well, knowledgeable is the nicest thing I've been told I have lately. So let me start by just talking a little bit about the legislative history, and I really did appreciate being here to hear the second portion, at least of the presentation, and the research, which ought to, at some point, we ought to actually let the research guide us. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of the charter bills that are pending before the legislature and where I think we are as of today. But with that, let me give a little bit of history. I know many in the room, some I don't, but I in my other life was a school board member, and have a wife who's a wonderful public school teacher, and I teach at 2 universities. And so I've always kind of believed, as a judge I clerked for once told me, that other than the love of your family, the next best thing in life is learning from a great teacher. And so I start with the proposition that, that teaching is the most important profession that we will ever have. And we can all sit here and talk about charters, and we can talk about, other people talk about vouchers, and others talk about uniforms, and others talk about all these different things, all of which in their own right serve a purpose. But improving public education is about having the most dedicated, competent professionals that you could possibly have at the front of the classroom as facilitators and as teachers and as leaders, and creating systems of support. If we put as much time into professional development and curriculum design and rethinking how we use the school day as we are into charters, we might be a little better off, I think. But that having been said, I want to go back to what I think and what a number of my colleagues think was the purpose of charters. And I have to tell you that I've come around in my life. In 1997, when the charters, or in 1998, when they were first proposed in Cumberland County, I was one of those school board members that reflexively said, not in my lifetime, and came to appreciate that was not a good thing, and that charters are in fact a form of public schools, and that there are reasons why they may be needed in communities and why they may need to exist. And there are good charters and there are bad charters. There are good traditional public schools, there are bad traditional public schools. And so I am no longer in the don't expand, don't do with charters. I think the question is exactly as raised by Dr. Ladd, is how do you do that, and do we move cautiously or do we move in a reckless fashion that can do damage? So that goes back to maybe a difference between some folks who are proposing Senate Bill 8 and some who have proposed House Bill 247. In 1988, when the idea of charters was first proposed, the idea came in a paper called Education by Charter, Restructuring School Districts. And the idea at the time was to allow teachers to apply for charters to run schools within their district, that charters would have some specific sets of goals with specific time frames as ways to improve public education, not compete with it, as ways to create better systems and structures for dealing particularly with students who weren't learning well in traditional public schools, to create different uses of time and resources, to create innovations and laboratories of innovation that might can create some replication, to improve how we teach in public schools and how we deliver instruction. And I think that model has been faithfully followed in some places, and where it hasn't been faithfully followed, serious damage has resulted. There have been, and I think in fact when it first came about, the then president of the American Federation of Teachers was sort of on board to create the idea of charters and enhanced charters, Albert Shanker, if I remember, and all coming about sort of as a result of the 1983 report on a nation at risk. But then we soon began to see the sort of Californication of charters, where California bought or got into charters, storefront charters. And by 2004 had the major storefront charter in California closed, stranding about 6,000 or 7,000 students as a result. I think it went belly up due to bankruptcy. We had charters in Philadelphia being indicted. We had charters that were not well managed, having serious fiscal and accountability problems. And that happens when you think you can simply open a school, replicate it from one place to another, and it's because I have good intentions, or in some cases maybe not so good intentions, I can create this new good school system that's better than the traditional school. And we all know that's not how you open a school. And good charter operators know that's not how you open a school. And so I think that the issue then became charters were turned from laboratories of design and ways to improve public education in some folks' minds to the competitor to public education and the free market alternative. And by creating the alternative, we create competition. Competition would therefore make the traditional public schools better, as if the teacher in the traditional classroom was going to be motivated to teach even better by having the charter school down the block as a competitor, which I think that is a real problem with the model. And that's maybe a big difference that sort of is out there. In that regard, I'm sort of guided a little bit, maybe a lot, by the work of Diane Ravitch, who was an Undersecretary of Education in the first President Bush, and was a big supporter of school choice and charters, a big supporter of accountability and testing, and in the last 5 to 6 years has come to change her mind, and has written a book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, in which she argues that the original idea behind charters has to some degree been perverted. And that is something we need to fight against if we want to keep true to what charters ought to be and how they can improve the public school system. And so with that in mind, we come to where we were in North Carolina. Charters were proposed. You all know the history of sort of the original bill. It had a cap and a limit of 100. We didn't do so well administratively in how we handle those charters in the first years. We have done increasingly better by experience, so have the charters. There's a lot more thought, in part because there's also a lot more guidance and history and requirements about how you open a charter, the checklist the state board requires that folks go through, and now more good charters than problem charters are opening. We may have other issues about sort of where that goes, but I think it can be said that folks who are applying now and where those applications are granted have generally been a lot better and more stable than they were in those first 6 or 7 years. Cumberland's an example. We have a charter school that is working to be improving considerably and does a fairly good job. We had our initial charter that was awful and closed in 2 years, fiscal accountability, all kinds of issues. Mid-year, 60 students returned into the system, money gone, you know, the total California problem. And so Senate Bill 8 comes along under, I think, a bipartisan idea at the time that we would be either increasing or removing the cap on charters to allow really good charters to develop within the context of a stable growth pattern that the state board had established and the criteria the state board had established. And I think that not everybody's on board. There's some people who always be opposed to charters. There's some people who think that charters should be granted, I think, helter-skelter. But that was where it was. And then all of a sudden, the bill morphed. Things have had a tendency this session to do that. And fundamentally, it changed. And by the time it came out of the Senate, instead of simply being a bill that either lifted or removed the cap, it kept generally the system we had in place about how you grew them, how you grew enrollment growth at the ones that existed. We ended up with one that took the charter school application process out of the, essentially out of the purview for the most part of the State Board of Education, except by veto, I think creating an unconstitutional system. Siphoning off right and left, in my view, money from the traditional public schools for, and to some degree there's an argument that there should be greater funding than there is, but not for services you don't provide. The thought that you can take transportation money, give it to a school that's not going to provide transportation, take child's nutrition money to a school that's not going to provide child nutrition, take band booster money or take athletic money or take any of those funds but not have an athletic team is, you know, just ludicrous. And that was contained, whether intentional or not, within the bill. It created a limit, no limit actually, as to the enrollment of a charter. You could, if you wanted to, create a charter of one. Whether that would have happened or not is irrelevant. The fact is the bill would have done that. It would have removed minimum attendance requirements for public schools. It would have opened up capital money to charter schools when you had a $10 billion capital growing list for traditional public schools. It would have, I think, created a competitor. A true competitor, not a model to improve public education. And I think the bill in its form that came over from the Senate was devastating. And I think it was, and I will say it, and I said it publicly, a bill lit up like a Christmas tree with everything that you could possibly have wanted if you followed the free competition competitor mode of charter schools. And I'm going to quote now, not from me, but from Ravitch's book, because I think this is precisely what happened. And she says, lost, it seems, was the original vision of charter schools, in which they were supposed to help solve some of the hardest problems of public education. As originally imagined, charters were not intended to compete with public schools, but support them. Charters were supposed to be research and development laboratories for discovering better ways of educating hard-to-educate children. They were not intended to siphon off the most motivated students and families in the poorest communities, but to address some of the public schools' most urgent problems. Charters are not supposed to disseminate the free market model of competition and choice and compete for the most successful students in the poorest communities. And this approach then disables the regular public schools in those communities by leaving the lowest performing and least motivated students in the regular public schools. It matters not. The original proponents of charter schools had different goals. It does matter, though, that charter schools have become, in many communities, a force intended to disrupt the traditional notion of public schooling. The rhetoric of many charter school advocates has come to sound uncannily similar to the rhetoric of voucher proponents in the most rabid haters of public schools. They often sound as though they want public schools to fail. If there is one consistent lesson that can be gleaned by studying school reform over the past century, it is the danger of taking a good idea and expanding it rapidly, spreading it thin. What is stunningly successful in a small setting, nurtured by its founders and brought to life by a cadre of passionate teachers, seldom survives the transition when it is turned into a large-scale reform. And with that in mind, we introduced House Bill 247 along with Representative Cotham, who was a prime sponsor on the bill, who's seated there. And what we tried to do in there was to stay true to the purpose of charters, but to recognize that they are a school tool of improvement if done well, and to lift the cap, because the cap is an arbitrary cap that no longer served the purpose that it originally intended at this point, serving a very good purpose when it was put in place. It would have eliminated the cap of 100, created an advisory North Carolina Charter School Commission with a constitutionally mandated oversight by the State Board of Education. And by the way, I think one of the errors the State Board made was eliminating the Charter Advisory Commission to begin with. That was not a good decision. It's turned out not to be a good decision. Third, the bill would have created limitations and added accountability and academic accountability standards for charter schools to remain in operation, and given the charter schools clear guidance as to what's expected. It would have imposed more stringent teacher certification requirements for low-performing charters. It would have barred charters from employing a teacher whose certification had been revoked, and why we ever allowed that, I cannot figure out. It would have maintained the minimum charter school enrollment at 65 students and allowed a charter school to grow once it's in place as requested or authorized in its charter, consistent with a plan of strategic growth. And it would have eliminated barriers for economically disadvantaged children to be able to attend the charters both on the transportation side and the child nutrition side. To tell me that you should create charters and they're going to serve the poor and then say, but we don't have to transport them, we don't have to feed them, someone's going to have to explain to me how in practice that would work. So all of that's to say that that's where we were at that point. All of us, I think, in the room, whether you're charter proponents, whether you're not, are about improving and reforming public schools. But the one thing that we also have to keep in mind is that public schools are the one institution in this country that has kept us as one country, as one people, under one flag with a common set of values. And if we ever lose public education, we lose this democracy. And to the extent whatever bill we pass strengthens public schools by returning the purpose of charters to their design, increasing access to them, we strengthen North Carolina and we strengthen our democracy. But any bill that attempts to do anything different than that may do serious harm, and the last thing we need to be doing right now is to harm traditional public schools or public schools in general and the education of children. I want to also conclude sort of the comments of prefatory and tell you where I think we are today by saying, you know, accountable, innovative charters, I think, are really important. And they are useful for the purpose they were designed to be. And we have some really good ones in this state. Some are in this county, some are in Durham. But if you believe, as someone said, that there's a sort of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that suggests that there's this singular treasure that charters are going to be. And that doesn't exist. It has never existed. And it will inflict serious harm on public education if we believe charters are the answer to the ills. Our intent in our House bill was to realistically and rationally and reasonably lift the cap on charters, ensure their continued accountability, and incrementally improve public education. As I indicated at our press conference when we filed that bill, letting 1,000 flowers bloom does not necessarily ensure a garden full of flowers. If the garden is left unattended and unsupervised, and instead I think it's likely to encounter a whole lot of weeds. And so our goal here is to let those flowers bloom, but to do it in a way that we can supervise, we can make it accountable, and we can make that garden a lot prettier and better. So where we are today, the bill came over from the Senate. We are undertaking a discussion repeatedly now over several weeks of Senate Bill 8. There were a series of amendments called for in the House Education Committee. Those of us who were involved in House Bill 247 filed 24 of them. There were several that were accepted by the Senate sponsor, Senator Stevens, who's been very responsive to us on the House side, and Representative Stamp. But there were a lot, including the major ones with regard to governance, accountability, diversity, a lot that weren't accepted. But there was an improvement in Senate Bill 8 in the committee process at the Education Committee, including some real improvements in the child nutrition transportation issue and on the financing side. The bill came out of the committee and I believe sits in finance or appropriations? Finance. But what's happened over the last week and a half is much more intense project negotiations that are occurring, including 2 hours after session on Monday and 2.5 hours last night by Senator Stevens, Representative Stam, folks from DPI, myself, and Senator Stein, to try to find an accommodation that really moves us much closer to sort of the idea of 247 and its rational, realistic goals of increasing and lifting the cap on charters, but to do so really answering some of the questions absolutely eloquently highlighted by the data and the presentation by Dr. Ladd. I am encouraged by those negotiations last night. I would not necessarily have said so last week, but I am encouraged by the negotiations. I think that we're making progress on trying to do what would be in the best interest of the state, and it will remain to be seen whether the parties will be able to continue to operate and negotiate a final bipartisan bill in good faith. But that's where we are as of an hour ago. Thank you.
I know our time is short, but I do want to give a couple of minutes to my colleague, Chris Hill, who directs the Education and Law Project at the North Carolina Justice Center. Chris came to the Justice Center last year or the year before, Chris?
Last year.
Last year, and has been this amazing addition to the staff of the Justice Center. He has led our Education and Law Project in great direction. He's a trainer, a lawyer, an advocate, a great writer. He wanted to share a few minutes with you about his work in that project and his thoughts on this topic today. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions. We'll maybe have everybody gather this table over here. But Chris, come ahead. Address this thing.
Thank you. I first want to introduce the staff of the Education and Law Project. This is policy advocate Matt Ellenwood. Stand up, Matt. And our policy fellow Tyler Wittenberg. Together we've been trying to do what I think the mission of the Education and Law Project is, which is to ensure not only the constitutional right to a sound basic education, which we believe is a floor, not a ceiling, but ensuring high quality education for low-income students in North Carolina and thereby doing it for all students in North Carolina. So when I started this job, I thought, we would be doing the normal education things like ensuring teacher quality, taking out the importance of high stakes testing, reducing the achievement gap. Turns out that I actually came in to the project not last year, but actually 1953. The schools are being desegregated in Wake County, and the schools that weren't, resegregating, some have not even been integrated at all. So that's an issue that we have to work on. And we're still not giving up on that. We're also having to work on issues like charter schools. And when I started, there was the cap of 100, and until this bill came out, and I'll tell you that we had been thinking about this early. In fact, Tyler had written an op-ed that was published in the Durham Herald-Sun on January 23rd, which was 3 days before the session even began, before Senate Bill 8 was even introduced. So we have been thinking about this for a while. But we didn't know what Senate Bill 8 was going to be, and it is quite disappointing. The education is about the free exchange of ideas, not free market principles. Schools aren't businesses, and children are not widgets. We can't use these principles to try to educate children. Some of Senate Bill 8 says that nonprofit institutions, nonprofit corporations have to run it. Now, just because you're a nonprofit corporation doesn't mean somebody can't make a whole lot of money. In the nonprofit world, we call that Schofield money. So, we can't believe that necessarily everybody has altruistic reasons for opening up charter schools. For some, this may be a business, nonprofit though. We were worried about accountability and oversight early. The DPI only, as you saw, only has 3 people to look over 99 schools. That's not a lot. That's not enough. So to expand the cap, we weren't for lifting of the cap at all. But to remove it or eliminate it, to raise it or eliminate it, would just make it difficult for the 3 people to look over. And what they do is they wait for a complaint before they go out. They don't, they don't have the capacity to go out and monitor these schools. In fact, looking at some of the charter schools, one that I saw was chartered in 1999, didn't get a first consultant visit until 2007. That's not acceptable. And so to want to eliminate a cap when we can barely govern what we have now is dangerous, barely do any oversight. We hear a lot about how great Raleigh Charter High School is, and I'm sure it is. However, they only accept students who are ready for Algebra 1 in 9th grade. That's not innovation, that's elitism. So what we have is a system that's not necessarily going to work. But what we also have is just one attack on public schools. Vouchers are another attack on public schools. The destruction of Smart Start and Ward 4. A recent study came out from Duke, Dr. Ladd, that says that students who live in jurisdictions where Smart Start and Ward 4 are well funded have higher reading levels in the 3rd grade, which is where we first start testing students. Now, and this is not only the students who, if I'm wrong, not only the students in the counties who attend Smart Start in Ward 4, they just live in the counties. Am I right about that? So, the destruction, you don't need innovation when you already have the innovation. That's innovative right there. If you can get students reading better at 3rd grade by stuff you already have, you don't need to lift the cap. And so, in addition to the vouchers, it's a small amount of money, it's $2,500, so the students who really need the money can't use it, and the students who get the money don't need it. So we have all of that. So I'm not a gun guy, I don't really know much about them. I know a little bit about buckshot though. And I know the way shotguns work is that you shoot and the buckshot goes in, and that'll destroy you. And so what we're having now, as in the attack on public schools, is just buckshot. Things are going here, things are going there, but they're just ripping apart public schools. We intend to be part of the fight on that, and we can tell by the fact that you're here that you do too. So I appreciate the time. Thank you.